Good morning and thank you for tuning in. Africa contributes around only 4% of global CO2 emissions, but is among the most vulnerable to negative impacts of climate change. All countries around the globe are urged to strike a balance between economic growth as well as increased emissions as they make commitments to fight climate change and reduce emissions. Going as far as the United Nations Secretary General calling on leaders to stop financing major fossil fuel projects pushing to transform amid SDG targets, subsidy reduction, and carbon taxes. In this year's Africa CEO Forum, we aim to look at how the continent and the private sector can navigate the changing times. On this particular panel discussion, we look at climate change and how carbon-intensive industries can adapt. I am Naringwa Fiona Muthoni, a business journalist with CNBC Africa, and I will be moderating this session. Joining me to unpack all these will be key industry leaders. Get comfortable, get your pens and notepads as well, because we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to send in your thoughts or comments, or you can write them here or you can share them on Twitter. Our handle is Africa CEO Forum. Also, feel free to use the hashtag ACF Digital Edition. To kick us off, I would like to invite a senior climate finance specialist at the International Finance Corporation, who is with us today, Berit Lindholt, to make her presentation.
Thank you, Fiona. It's a pleasure to be here today. Africa, not counting South Africa, accounts for only about 3% of total global greenhouse gas emissions and is yet to achieve industrialization. It is the most exposed region to the adverse effects of climate change, despite contributing the least to global warming. GHG emissions are dominated by carbon released as a result of the agricultural practices, deforestation, fires, and forest degradation. However, the energy sector is expected to become the dominant emitter as Africa grows and industrializes. Climate change is causing food insecurity, population displacement, and stress on water resources. The opportunities for transformative mitigations and adaptations will be to move towards more climate resilient development and to green industries. That means helping the largest emitters flatten the emission curve and ramping up sustainable finance to help the region and its private sector prepare for and adapt to climate change. Of these 5 sectors found to account for over 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions, I will highlight 4 sectors relevant to Africa. The energy challenge is immense. Over half of Africa's populations lack access to energy. 77% of power generated is from fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. And it's essential that low carbon technologies become available and financially attractive to avoid a lock-in of emission-intensive technologies. With an abundance of solar, wind, and geothermal resources, Africa has a comparative advantage in renewables, and with the falling cost of green technologies, there is a unique chance to leapfrog the fossil fuel-dependent energy system. Agriculture and land use systems are vital for Africa's economy. Accounting for 70% of livelihoods and almost 1/4 of regional GDP, climate change has serious adverse impacts on livelihoods. There is a need to scale up climate-smart agricultural practices, reduce vulnerability to drought, pests, and diseases, and adapt to shortened seasons and erratic weather patterns. In other words, pursue lower emissions for each kilo of food produced and avoid deforestation. All this while increasing productivity to improve food security and boost incomes. With the increasing urbanization in Africa, it's key to decarbonize cities. This means supporting policies, regulations, and investments to improve air quality, decarbonize energy sectors, promote green buildings and solid waste management, and clean transportation, as well as improve efficiency of water supply, sanitation, and wastewater treatment. High-emitting industries such as cement, glass, steel, chemicals are energy-intensive, and it's essential to develop a clean, decentralized, and interconnected power grid to provide clean energy to these sectors. These high emitters will soon come under pressure to cut emissions to remain competitive in the global market. Changes in national energy subsidies and/or carbon taxes, including import carbon taxes as envisioned in Europe, will narrow their competitive edge. Furthermore, international investors are increasingly reallocating their investments to carbon-efficient companies. Green finance for green growth will be essential. Financial institutions have a key role to play, mobilizing finance for green investments and helping their clients decarbonize. The green bond has been a game changer, mobilizing capital markets. In 2020, the green bond market size passed 1 trillion, and the green bond issuance in the emerging markets is projected to double and cross the 100 billion mark by 2023. Green bonds sparked a growth of the green finance ecosystem, and many countries, including China, Europe, South Africa, and Chile, have launched sustainable finance policies and regulations, often also developing a national or regional taxonomy. The increasing focus on sustainable finance reflects the need to mobilize private capital to fund the Paris commitment, but it's also looking to build the resilience of the financial system against the instability that climate change may cause. The Green Bond has stimulated a range of innovative sustainable finance instruments, and please don't get lost in the small print of this slide. Total volumes of labeled sustainable debt market reached nearly half a trillion in the first 6 months of 21, and it's setting the market on track to surpass the 2020 record. The increasing interest in sustainability framed products is driven in part by regulation, in part by increasing awareness of climate change. For the issuer, sustainable frame finance can be a question of access to finance. Issuing sustainability-themed debt instruments attract a wider and a more diverse group of investors. It's also a way to enhance their franchise value and communicate their sustainability strategy in response to an increasing scrutiny by investors. Committing to a green use of money and/or set sustainability targets will help the issuer think through the sustainability risks and opportunities. Financing green assets, as narrowly defined, for instance, by the Green Bond principles, will not take us to net zero by 2050. Greening high-emitting sectors will be key. Last year, 2 new instruments, the Sustainability-Linked Bond and the Climate Transition Finance label, were introduced. Instruments that can help not-so-green companies, but companies that are committed to go green, access sustainability-framed finance. Sustainability-linked finance, which links, for instance, the interest rate to the performance of the issuer, has shown a significant growth in little time and is expected to open the market for carbon-intensive companies committed to a sustainability strategy. It moves focus from finance of green assets to finance of green performance. The climate transition label is for those ready to commit to the net zero by 2050 or sooner. It is still uncertain what qualifies as credible climate transition, and the market data here is likely to include transactions that does not meet the intent of the label. The next slide of green bonds issued in Africa is to give you a quick snapshot of the green bond market in Africa. The market is still nascent. We have seen a sovereign green bond issued in Nigeria, but the typical issuer is a financial institution. Few, if any, corporate issuers. The typical African green bond is financing renewable energy, energy efficiency, and green buildings. That brings me to my concluding remarks. A World Bank study finds that climate inaction could force as many as 100 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. The decarbonization targets are clear implications for business, and Africa's private sector has powerful reasons to transition to protect values and the well-being of the people. The focus in Africa will be to move towards more climate resilient development and greening industries to avoid being locked into unsustainable production systems. Sustainable finance infrastructure, including regulation and development of national or regional capital markets, need to be designed to create scale and enable the region to tap into the international sustainable finance markets. Transition is not a linear path. Africa's green transition should be flexible in sequence, pace, and scale to reflect country and sub-regional specificities and development goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that conversation. That was Berit Lindholt, the Senior Climate Finance Specialist at the International Finance Center. And definitely the presentation sets the pace for this panel discussion. Allow me to introduce the panelists for today. We will have Kola Adesina, Executive Director of the International Energy Conglomerate, Sahara Group, operating across Africa in oil and gas. We will also have Tariq Badegesin, the CEO and Managing Director, ARM Harris, which is investing in infrastructure projects in West Africa. And finally, Gregory Clement, CEO, Propaco, a development finance institution partly owned by the French Development Agency, which offers financial support through private sector loans and invests in green bonds, as well as climate renewable energy funds. Now, let's just dive into this conversation. I think I'll start with Kola. Africa's carbon emissions are negligible on the global scales. I mean, even looking at the statistics from the presentation by Berit, it shows that Africa's contributes about 3%. And some people can ask, why should the continent sacrifice its economic development and lifting millions out of poverty for a potentially costly green transition? Over to you, Kola.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona. Well, you rightly asked a question around the fact that the contribution of Africa in terms of green gas is just very low. Carbon emission here is extremely very low. So invariably, based on equity, justice, and fairness, we shouldn't be the focal point. But yet, we are the dumping ground, so to speak, of all the effects of carbon emission from other parts of the world. So invariably, we should really be concerned as regards to what is happening globally and the impact of what is happening globally on us. For us, from a developmental model perspective for Africa, the sequencing of activities and investment is very critical here, noting the stage of development in Africa, most especially around industrialization, electricity consumption and usage, and the need for us to quickly electrify based on the population that we have currently in Africa. We're so backward. The energy security is so low. Food is a challenge. Agriculture is beginning to be very daunting on the basis of drought and some of the other climate-related challenges that we're facing. But be that as it may, for us in Africa, I would want to propose that we embrace us very quickly, more than any other part of the world, climate-friendly investment, technologies and innovation to be able to help us. And just like Barry had posited in our remark, it's interesting to note that Africa has abundant solar facilities. Sun is there, so invariably we can leverage on that. Because of the low cost of the technology lately, a lot of us are aggressively looking out in supporting and pushing the climate-friendly investments around renewable energy, energy transition, and the rest of them. Most of the cities and locations in Africa are not connected to the grid. Invariably, the infrastructure deficiency is something we need to cure. And thankfully, amongst the many things you listed are of investment opportunities, financing opportunities, and solutions that we can use. But in terms of fairness, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of the stage in which Africa is, we shouldn't be ranked at the same level with the global world. But we are moving in the right direction in terms of our focus today.
Yeah, we're moving in the right direction. And Kola, there, you've just touched on the untapped solutions that lie within the continent of Africa. Tariq, to come to you, in the past you have said that African countries cannot abandon the brown industries, those that depend on oil, gas, as well as minerals, and create an economy, a green economy overnight. So how can they be used as a tool to achieve a clean, sustainable economy?
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you very much for having me here today for this critical conversation. I think the Berit mentioned the issue of climate transition. The reality is, African economies have predominantly been built on carbon-intensive industries, and for those to be eliminated overnight would present existential issues that would effectively throw the continent into crisis. And the principle of the just transition that's enshrined in the Paris Accord as one of the three pillars of the Paris Accord envisions that there must be a just transition for replacing the jobs from the sort of carbon intensive era toward the low carbon future. But imagine for countries in Africa, we're going to need to reposition entire economies, not just sectors. And repositioning entire economies means that while there may be certain sectors that had been producing resources that go into, say, the transportation value chain, those industries need to start thinking about how to position for a green value chain. And so, whereas the oil and gas sector needs to envision a very near term future where petrol and vehicle fuel will significantly diminish, there will continue to be a need for resilient materials and plastics. And in fact, the IEA does forecast that plastics would remain resilient. And so, what this means from a private sector standpoint, going to the theme of this conversation around private operators adapting their strategies to climate change, is to seek to integrate more renewable energy, significantly more renewable energy into their mix, either from a production standpoint or from a utilization standpoint, but at the same time, re-strategize and reposition their sort of more fossil or related industries for the green sector. And also, while doing that, use science-based approaches to managing their emissions within that space. And for example, the issue of batteries is very important. Africa contains some of the greatest deposits of cobalt and lithium. And it's very important that Africa does position itself for the future of batteries and storage. And I think I was on a very interesting just transition conversation hosted by the PRI, where there's a discussion about how can we actually use green bonds and potentially climate transition bonds to support African governments to shift from petroleum-based resources to battery-based minerals. Like, would that qualify? So we do need to take a step back and think about how we reposition the entire African economy, our industrialization path, to be cleaner, to lock in a low carbon pathway, but to also position for the green future. And there will be resource opportunities for the green future, and there needs to be support for all of that to take place.
Yeah, Tari has just touched on the importance of taking a step back and just looking and measuring the possible solutions and getting to know the best way forward. But I just want to understand from Gregory, looking at the transition, how are we approaching the transition? We know that globally, investor support for high carbon industries is diminishing. But is that the case for Africa, where millions depend on carbon intensive farming and are still without energy access?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette question, puis également pour l'invitation à échanger aujourd'hui autour de ce thème extrêmement important. Effectivement.
Indeed,
il est important pour des
for PFIs such as Proparco, it is absolutely essential to assess the transition and to adapt our ways of doing. What I like to say is that what we are interested in about the African continent is the huge potential regarding this. Africa is a continent where there's a lot still to be built. And today there is no lock-in effect that is too major, and we can therefore borrow or take an interesting transition. It seems that Gregory has some sound issues.
Yeah, anyway, let me just go back to Tarie, because earlier on you touched on the importance of transition. I want to know what needs to happen for companies to get serious about reducing the emissions. Are we moving at the right pace as a continent?
It's the question about transition and how African companies and countries can confront transition is key. Um, it needs to start with a science-based inventory of the state of emissions and the potential pathways and the potential growth. If you look at African cities, for example, they are expected to sort of triple in CO2 over the next 10 years as their populations are expected to increase significantly. So the reality is that companies do need to take a science-based inventory of where they are today and then start thinking about how we get to a point of neutrality. Neutrality is actually a very important principle that is going to hold true going forward, which is around the impact of our activities on others. I think for the longest time, organizations, emitted or produced without thinking about the holistic impact of their activities. And neutrality is going to take cognizance of sort of the holistic impact of what is produced, supply chains, emissions throughout the supply chain, what happens in the environment, impact on forestry, etc. And so what a lot of companies are now doing is thinking about how do they increase renewable energy in terms of how they're using it and how they're producing it? How do they introduce more efficient energies throughout their supply chain? And then for certain areas that are unabatable, how do you introduce offsets, for example, or using voluntary carbon markets? So there's going to have to be almost a climate balance sheet, a climate budget, sort of moving beyond financial metrics to climate metrics. And it's very early days for African entities and African governments to do that. We're seeing it happen more in the developed markets, but there's great criticism. So it's really early days for all of us to start thinking about this climate balance sheet, climate balance budget, and climate accounting, climate projections through everything that we do.
Yeah, but it's still crucial for Africa to actually be at the center front when looking at this transition when it's happening. Kola, coming to you, to what extent do you feel that sufficient support actually does exist for your company to move to a greener energy? And what would you like to see more being done?
Okay, for us in Sahara, there are 4 critical platforms we stand on in terms of strategic direction as an organization. The first one is for us to be highly innovative and creative. Adaptability is another point that is very essential to us as an organization, where we want to remain more responsive and as diverse as possible. Now, invariably, we put the 4 things together as a pillar. As an organization, we're shifting from oil to more sustainable LPG, but we are equally intentionally growing our power portfolio to incorporate significant renewable energy over the next 5 years. At Sahara Power Group, our ambition is not just to own at least 5,000 megawatts of power generating capacity in Africa, but equally to be able to lift the renewable aspect of our operations in terms of how we accelerate development of renewable greenhouse generation efforts. We are now equally investing in solar home systems, biofuels far more quickly. Mini grid is something we're putting our money on, as well as off-grid. These are areas of interest to us as we begin to pursue the agenda of transition. But we need to do it just exactly like Tari mentioned, incrementally, step by step, sequencing it in a manner that ultimately will take us to where we want to be. The poverty level is very high here. The resources are so many, but then we need to balance consumption, production, and investment as an organization. Those are the things we're doing currently, but we're far, far, far more gone now in ensuring that our investment becomes a reality in Africa.
Yeah, just before we even invite our next guest who will be joining us shortly, David Alial, I just want to hear from Gregory, but briefly, We touched on the bond issuers. We touched on looking at alternative instruments for financing. They are gaining momentum here on the continent, but what should be done in order for the appetite to actually increase within the continent and people getting more using those safety and sustainable instruments?
Merci beaucoup. Pour moi, en fait, ce qui est important,
Yes, for me, it's really essential to transform Africa potential and to assist these transitions. In order to do that, we have to import technical assistance. We have to transfer technologies, that's the first thing, in order to improve the competitiveness of African companies. These are the first steps. Once this is done, along with this, we can work on the development of financial instruments. We talked about mobilization, green bonds, and of course, we need to do some work on a daily basis with the credit institutions for the local banks in order to transform them and guide them towards green finance, because they have in their portfolio companies that are very polluting or that are related to the fossil fuel industry. We need to guide them towards climatic finance. So there are different instruments to do so, and we'll set them up ourselves. Green bonds are the most essential elements in this. And I will finish with one last aspect, the mobilization of private investors. Today, one of our objectives will be to guide the private investors towards developing countries in order to finance the sustainable development goals.
Oh, okay, thank you so much for that. I'd also like to remind each and every one of you following this conversation that if you have any questions or comments, you can write to us on Twitter. Our handle is Africa CEO Forum, or you can use the hashtag ACF Digital Edition. Now, before we continue with the panel discussion, I would like to invite David Aliali, West Africa Supply Chain and Logistics Manager at Bolloré Logistics, based in Cote d'Ivoire. He is going to give us perspective on indirect private sector emissions. The French group Bolloré has the largest integrated logistics network here on the continent, and the company ships products for large companies and SMEs by sea, air, rail, as well as road. David, it's great having you here with us today.
Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction.
Yes, now to just get into the conversation, given the finance gap here on the continent faced by different companies to reduce even direct emissions, to what extent are African customers truly concerned about Scope 3 indirect emissions that come from transportation and the logistics network?
In Africa, our major industrial, mining, oil and gas, and food customers are clearly more and more concerned about the Scope 3 emissions impact, even if the level of awareness and sensitivity is still improving. In this context, as a private sector leader in Africa, we take a proactive approach in reducing our carbon footprint. In fact, Bolloré Group works on a daily basis to reduce the environmental impact of its activities by committing to improving its energy efficiency, reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, its dependence to fossil fuel, and strengthen its ESG performance. Within the framework of our public and private partnerships conducted by the port business units, we noticed that the GHG emissions reduction objectives are not systematically included into the contractual framework. However, our collaboration with the DFIs allows us to take into consideration these objectives in the financing structuring of our projects. Beyond that, beyond those contractual prerequisites, Bolloré Ports recently launched an unprecedented green labelization process of its facilities worldwide called Green Terminal. This initiative features several components, such as building sustainable infrastructure, use of eco-friendly material handling equipment to promote the alternative energies, implementation of digitalization systems. Moreover, it promotes the concepts of a circular economy with waste recovery and recycling, water treatment, societal commitment to local stakeholders. This program has been approved by Bureau Veritas that we audited the 21 port concession worldwide. As part of it, in our Bolloré Logistics business unit, with our CSR program called Powering Sustainable Logistics, we committed to reduce our GHG emissions by 27, about 43% for Scope 1 and Scope 2. And we are working currently to commit on a quantified reductions for the Scope 3, which is about 96% of our emissions. On the same note, in 2019, Bolloré Rail equipped its subsidiary Camrail in Cameroon with 10 times less polluting locomotives, representing an investment of nearly 25 million USD, enabling the company to reduce the GHG emissions. Finally, I will talk about Bolloré Energy, which is a business unit less known in Africa, but these business units aim at reducing GHG emission by introducing the biofuel that allows a 9% reduction of CO2 emissions compared to the domestic fuel. Thank you, Fiona.
Okay. Yeah, now, David, thank you for that presentation. Just even looking across the value chain of Bolloré, where do you think the bulk of your emissions are coming from here on the continent? Is it road? Is it railway line? Is it air, sea? Is it even the warehousing? And what are the challenges to cut emissions in this particular area?
Thanks, Fiona, for the question. That's a good question. That will be straightforward. According to the International Transport Forum in 2016, the transport activity is responsible for 8% of CO2 emission worldwide. 62% of it is being generated by the road freight alone. So if the global freight growth trend continues, the CO2 emissions will double by 2050 compared to 2015. Therefore, in order to reach the Paris COP21 targets, the transport sector must accelerate its transition toward a carbon-free activity, thanks to a combination of alternative energy sources, increasing fleet efficiencies, and better use of assets. In addition to the financing of those carbon-free initiatives, which are obviously an issue, the other challenges are the internationalization of the infrastructure, the promotion of renewable energy sources, even if the technologies to power them are not totally mature yet, and finally, the rationalization of logistic systems. Moreover, given the existing gap infrastructure in Africa, both public and the private sector must create the condition for us to directly design resilient and eco-friendly infrastructure. In this context, the example of the AirWeb logistic platform launched in 2019 in Abidjan, which features 100% electric material handling equipment, as well as the compliance with the age principle, is a good illustration of what we can achieve together. Thank you, Fiona.
Oh, thank you so much, David. Now, earlier on, you even touched on the plans for Bolloré to reduce the emissions, but what is needed when you look at the different financial instruments that are needed to even go further on the continent and to reduce reliance on fossil fuels?
Okay, thank you. I think the panelists went through those points. As I was previously saying, green initiatives requires a certain level of investment to be triggered. For example, rail development or other alternative transport solutions like the barging represent solid solutions for reducing GHG emissions in the transport sector. However, most of those projects hardly demonstrate a financial profitability in the short term, while there is an obvious rentability in the long term. This is why we believe that in terms of financing, green taxation and green financing, as well as the related incentives, are clearly the next frontier on the African perimeter. So to be straightforward, we need to move further in this green financing, and I was glad to hear about the green bond improvements in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that presentation on indirect private sector emissions. That was David Aliali, who is the West Africa Supply Chain and the Logistics Manager at Bolloré Logistics in Cote d'Ivoire. Now, to bring the panelists back into the conversation, Kola, I'll start with you. Your company is shifting from oil to greener energy sources, such as the liquefied petroleum gas. if there was more financial resources available, how would you further transform your business in a greener direction?
Okay. One of the things we're positioned ourselves to do is to spend more of our investment, just like I mentioned earlier, in renewable energy, whilst making more efficient our current assets as well to deliver value in the interim. We are of the belief that industries will still be powered largely by the conventional energy. Gas is something that is central to our own production system today. And with regards to GHG, gas is not so high up there in terms of carbon emissions. So invariably, we're still going to continue to push gas as a frontier for developing our energy space, most especially electricity, more than any other thing. Pending when we see a leapfrog in the renewable side. And that leapfrog for us is for us to say we've dimensioned our business along the served, the underserved, and then the unserved. So for us, the unserved would be catered to with mini grid, off grid, and other renewable solution. The underserved will have a complement, a blend of both renewable as well as the grid solution, the gas thermal plants we're running. And then the served, we will continue to push them to be able to take more power. However, please note, in Africa, part of the issue is the question of affordability. Accessibility is impacted by affordability because of the fact that at the end of the day, our investment needs to be realized for us to make more investment. If people are perceived not to be able to afford electricity, invariably pushing investment in that direction will be a challenge. So what renewable energy is doing for us is, as long as renewable energy remains going downward in terms of cost of production and the price is right in answering the affordability question, then invariably it makes it easier for more investment to be triggered. As I said, sunlight is readily available in Africa, so we're going to be taking abundance of that in our own investment portfolio. So today, we're moving in that direction, and we're moving aggressively to ensuring that renewable energy is the way to go.
Yeah, renewable energy is the way to go. Terry, coming to you, Africa's led industrialization put the continent at a significant disadvantage in the past. But you believe that this can actually be its greatest asset when you're looking at transitioning to a green future. How can we piggyback off this and be ahead of the curve?
Thank you. Right. You know, indeed, Africa is quite late to the game in terms of industrialization, and especially coming in at a time when there are going to be, and in fact are already, significant shifts in how production takes place and how consumption takes place, especially with the fourth industrial revolution and sort of changing supply chains. And then you also layer on some of the geopolitical considerations. But the reality is that given that we are late to the game, as we were late to the telecoms game, there is a significant opportunity for us to actually embed efficient and clean energy systems into our industrial production systems so that we don't lock in a sort of gray path, but lock in a green path. Because we can actually start by, in terms of our expansion of existing plants or our sort of investment in new assets, to use renewable energy from the start, right? At this point, a lot of large-scale assets, David mentioned green terminals. A lot of developed countries have to retrofit their assets for greening. In this case, we would be building new assets. So we can already build some of our ports to include renewable energy or more efficient and renewable energy powered cold chains, for example. So the opportunity we have in Africa right now is actually to build our industrialization path from the ground up with renewable energy, smarter consumption, embedding technology that allows us have sort of smarter interplays, for example, with the grid, with the consumer, with the supply chain. But it also takes work, and it's going to take a special kind of investment, and it's going to take a lot of support from the DFIs. It's going to take support from governments and also the private sector to welcome innovation, because some of those technologies are going to be a bit expensive to implement right now, or the benefits might not be immediately obvious. But it's a really great opportunity, and I don't want to use the word leapfrog because I think that's thrown around too much. I think really what we want to talk about is positioning African industrialization as a clean industrialization, so that we can benefit from the green bonds and all the new capital, but we need support, because the answer here is not to ask us not to industrialize. We have to be encouraged to industrialize green.
Grégory, comment maximiser donc l'impact de cette industrialisation verte? Donc le son a été un petit peu bizarre. Donc pour en revenir à Grégory, où est-ce que l'accent particulier va être mis pour donc l'investissement vert pour un impact maximum? Grégory, vous avez la parole. Yes, indeed. I completely agree with what has been said. We have to choose for Africa the right path for industrialization. And it's true that the PFI have a major role to play. I mentioned the technical assistance, but the financial conditions are also essential to guide finance in favor of renewable energies. This is absolutely essential. And we have to do that possibly with the smoother possible conditions in order to enable this industrialization as quickly as possible, with new technologies that are issuing less emissions, that are environmentally friendly. So this is why we are involved in this field. There are industries that emit a lot of CO2s, and it's absolutely essential to see that we have started already, and we can guide this industrialization in the field of steel. For example, steel production, we know that there's a lot of electricity consumption, and if we move to renewable electricity, it has a strong impact, because for example, the raw materials, if we do not use coals, well, there are existing alternatives already. The recycling of iron also is a way to change the deal in a significant manner. There are other industries also. For example, in the B2B sector or in the B2C sector, there are different steps in the value chain, and I think it has been highlighted previously. And we can do that in other sectors in which we want to continue taking actions. For example, the cement industry that are often pointed, but cement is essential to build the infrastructures. Well, the cement production, we know that 2/3 of the production come from a chemical reaction. It could be relevant to set up carbon capture facilities, and we could turn towards entrants that are less carbon issuing, so we can choose raw materials that could be emitting less in those local supply chains. So we can work on the whole value chain in order to limit the impact on the environment. My last point, if I may, is to do with the reporting and the capacity that we can have to measure the different impacts. And in this field, and it's really essential to have a methodology that is recognized regarding the measuring of impact, because it's with this technology that in the future we'll be able to attract investors in order to launch the Africa industrialization with green technologies.
Oh, thank you so much, Gregory. You've touched on a very important point of measuring the impact. Lowering emissions also means having to measure them. And we know that Sahara Group is reporting to GRI standards to measure its sustainability performance. Kola, coming to you, how much additional cost and time does this add? And is this realistic for most African companies?
Okay, thank you, Fiona. Well, reporting to GRI standards, whilst there is a cost to it, has enabled us as an organization to create objective picture, which is globally comparable, of the impact of our activities across the triple bottom line of the people, the planet, and profit. For us, first is always the people, and the next one is the planet, as well as then, again, the profit. We've introspected as an organization in this area because of the fact that we want to hold ourselves to the highest level of corporate responsibility. When David was speaking earlier, I was quite impressed with the fact that the CRI activities specified so much in terms of the diversity of their portfolio and the intensity of ensuring that renewable energy is the bedrock of doing that. So ours is to create a shared value. And in doing that, it's been, like I said, very expensive, but a detailed analysis of the report over the years has created for us the drive to reduce the cost of operation. Environmental impact is very critical to us as an organization, as well as stakeholder engagement, most especially again around risk mitigation, more than any other thing. We want to ensure that not only are we global, we need to be local. We want to be able to take our local realities into consideration. Timing is of essence to us, but again, ultimately, how do we ensure that the bottom line is achieved? Small and medium-sized companies may find it difficult, really, to report to GRI standard because of the cost, like I mentioned earlier, and the time of investment that is required. For us, if you want to grow, your aspiration will determine where you put your money. We have put our own money based on the objective criteria we've set for ourselves as an organization, and we're moving significantly in those areas. Standardization and contextualization, they are both important in terms of GRI, but so far, sustainable reporting standard is something that helps the organization more than any other thing if you're going to go far, and you need to be transparent in the world we live in today.
Yeah, we saw research from Brookings Institute has suggested that carbon taxes here on the continent can reduce income inequality and promote a post-COVID economic recovery. But others see carbon taxes as highly detrimental to Africa's development. To what extent can carbon taxes be the right path forward for Africa? Taria, over to you.
Thanks, Fiona. I think that one of the real starting points should actually be removal of subsidies and distortions. I really think that should be the starting point for Africa, in that at this point, there are some conflicting messages or policy messages around what sectors are highly subsidized, what sectors have beneficial tax regimes and the like. I really think that is the starting point. Because in order to drive the increase in the use of solar energy, for example, solar panels should not be charged tariffs at all from when imported. support with even the manufacturing of solar panels in country, etc. So I really think that should be the starting point. Whereas, taxation of carbon is something that is I think is a bit more developed markets right now. And then I think it's something we could integrate at a later stage. But the distortions in the subsidy environment for certain sectors could potentially slow the adoption of cleaner solutions just by virtue of inconsistencies in market.
Yeah, I think, Kola, I'll just pose the same question to you. To what extent are carbon taxes the right path forward for Africa? I mean, you are particular in this, being in the African continent, you're working, dominating in the sector when you look at oil and gas. Do you think that this is actually the right way forward?
Yeah, well, like I said, there's a balancing that is required here, most especially in terms of our stage of development as a continent, as well as the population that we have, the size of our population, and the resources available for us to be able to take advantage and move our people from poverty to prosperity. I agree to carbon tax fully. It's helpful, it's useful, but then I think you need to take an holistic view of where Africa is and where Africa needs to be, the resources required, the initiatives that can be pushed, and how those initiatives are being pushed. How do you get a confluence of ideas and energy together to be able to resolve Africa's challenges using technology and the will of people and governments? The carbon tax is very
and what
essential.
would you hope to see, Kola? Just saying with you, from the regulation points on carbon intensive industries, what would you what would you suggest?
Well, for me, I think it's about how do you accelerate rapid economic progress. You can only cure poverty by creating employment. You can't create employment if you don't industrialize. So you need to find a way of ensuring that we move away from just exporting natural resources to now using the natural resources inland to creating products, and products that are environmental friendly, and that production is environmental friendly so that people can now begin to consume them. Now we need to, like I said earlier, the tripod of investment, savings, and consumption. We need to push more of investment. We need to push more of savings, and savings here can be equally in terms of energy that we're using and how the energy is being used. But the regulation must center around how do you create an enabling framework that would allow the Tarriers of this world, the Clements of this world, the David of this world to bring the ideas together to accelerate the progress that they desire to see. The long-term focus is something that is really very important, that can really engender the level of growth we want to see on the basis of carbon emission as an agenda globally. Regulation, I think, is very key in that regard. Equally, like I said earlier, the think tanks that we can bring together, because today we have gotten to a position that globally we're speaking of peak oil. So peak oil simply means that we need an alternative means of ensuring that we generate electricity or whatever energy. So how do we ensure that we move quickly into the future by ensuring that we use what we have today to take us to where we want to go to tomorrow, but then step by step along the line, we get to the future together.
Yeah, step by step, we get to the future together. Gregory, I'm just going to pose this to you. We're seeing different African countries that are forging different trade pacts with more developed countries, the Western countries. But just looking at these new, more appetite, more connections that are coming within the world, can we expect stricter requirements on emissions that could impact African exports to the EU or even other international partners?
Yes, I think so. I think that the main issue here is the attractivity of the different countries and their competitivity, and also the way the other countries will have to turn to Africa in order to import maybe consumer goods locally produced. It has just been said earlier, but I think that regulation will be a key in order to do that. At the moment, there is a pressure on the consumer about that, and it really shows that the consumers are really concerned about the way the products they buy are being produced. For example, when Europe imports, or when the United States or China imports goods produced in Africa, and when it will happen in the future, they will be very concerned about the way it has been produced. So we need to have a look at the entire production chain, and when we have a look at it, we notice something which is very interesting, which is that the banks financing the economy and the investors giving them money, should we talk about local investors, but also investors from northern countries, they slowly but surely impose conditions in order for them to use the funds they give them. So they want those funds to be used to go on the way of green energies and to use value chains which are great value chains which are more and more respectful of the environment. It is a trend that we observe. As a DFI, we accompany that because when we give funds to banks in order for them to fund the economy, we ask a few requirements, and some of them are in link with the impact on climate change. So if you have a look at all the DFI, you can see that they are asking a strong commitment on the percentage of funds which would have a positive impact on the climate. And in our case, around 40% of our activity should have a positive impact on the climate. And we are particularly focusing on the African continent because, as it has been said, things are changing now.
Oh, thank you so much. I think we're even running out of time. But before we close this panel discussion, I'd like each one of us to just say one last final word. We know that Africa has a lot of potential, but where do you see Africa in the long, as well as even short term? I'll start with Tarier.
I think the key point I wanted to send across here is that the cost of positioning Africa for a low carbon future is going to be immense. And there is in fact, the cost of positioning the world for the low carbon future is going to be immense. And imagine a continent starting from behind. And so Africa is going to need a tremendous amount of financial support across the investment spectrum, support for the development of projects, innovation, private equity, debt capital, and we really need the global community to support us with both finance and technical capacity to position us for a low carbon future, but also one that improves livelihoods and generates wealth for the continent.
Oh, thank you, Tarier. Kola, I'll throw it to you.
For me, just exactly like Tarier had mentioned, Africa needs so much of attention at this point in time. If we're the one receiving the carbon emission of the world, invariably the world needs to be fair enough to bring in an investment that will help change our narrative today. From where we have backward in terms of industrialization, we're backward in terms of production, we're backward in terms of mechanization and the rest of them. We need to be able to have a conference of solution package to helping Africa get to where she needs to get to. The continent is so central in terms of the population, in terms of the intellectual capital we bring to the world, and in terms of the fact that we have people that are definitely resilient and useful in building the world as we know it today. So it's now time to build Africa through the lenses of those who took advantage of Africa in time past. We need help here. We need solution that can help us. We need finance.
And Gregory, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So personally, I think that Africa has the opportunity now to start working on a new low carbon emission path without following the example of developed countries, which sometimes were bad examples, and they can use the right technologies of the moment. And if we combine the use of those new technologies with sustainable finance, following practical principles which try to promote a low impact on the environment, I'm sure that we'll be able to carry out the right transition for Africa.
Oh, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's panel discussion. Indeed, it is time for Africa to build its sectors as well as its economies, and it will need all players to come together and achieve the set targets. The most important thing, one thing that is happening for sure, is that we're having the tough and needed conversation. I was your moderator for today. My name is Arnarengwa Fiona Muthoni, and with me on the panel, I had Kola Adesina, Executive Director of the International Energy Conglomerate Sahara Group. We also had Tariq Badegesin, the CEO and Managing Director, ARM Harith. And finally, we had Gregory Clement, CEO of Propaco. Thank you all so much for making time to be with us today. And right after this session, we actually have a very important conversation that will be happening between Eleni Giokos of CNN and Africa's sixth richest man, the CEO of the conglomerate BUA Group, Abdul Samad Rabiu. Stay tuned.